When you look at the history of human warfare, the motivations are usually pretty straightforward. Empires fight over fertile valleys, massive oil fields, strategic warm water ports, or cities paved with gold. You can understand the logic. Greed makes sense. But occasionally the global superpowers run out of valuable things to steal, and they start fighting over the absolute bottom of the geographical barrel. I want you to imagine the most worthless, miserable, uninhabitable piece of real estate on planet Earth. I'm not talking about deserts, I'm not talking about a frozen tundra, I'm talking about a literal rock, a single jagged spike of granite, sticking out of a freezing, violent swells of the North Atlantic Ocean, 300 miles away from civilization. It has no fresh water, it has no soil, it has no flat surface. Its primary export for the last 10,000 years has been seagull vomit. And yet, during the Cold War, the British Empire, the same empire that once ruled a quarter of the globe, deployed elite military commandos, Royal Navy warships, the helicopters to conquer it. Welcome to the geopolitical void. In this video we're looking at the occupation of Rockall. We're going to explore how international maritime law turned a 60-foot tall avian latrine into a multi-billion-dollar gold mine. We'll look at the absolute absurdity of the Cold War, where the fear of Soviet submarine drove nations to claim sovereignty over a pebble. And we'll see what happens when human bureaucracy tries to legally prove that a rock covered in bird shit is actually a cozy, habitable island. If you thought your country's foreign policy was a joke, wait until you see 4 different nations threatening diplomatic collapse over a piece of granite. Grab a life jacket and a very strong umbrella. It's going to get wet, cold, and incredibly stupid. To understand the sheer unadulterated comedy of this geopolitical crisis, we first have to visualize the prize. We have to look at Rockall. If you look at the map of North Atlantic between Scotland and Iceland, there is a whole lot of nothing. Just deep, freezing, terrifying ocean. But right in the middle of that nothingness, protruding from the waves like the rotting tooth of a drowned sea monster, is Rockall. It's a 60 feet high and about 60 or 80 feet across at its base. That's it. It's smaller than suburban driveway. The sides are practically vertical. The ocean swells around it routinely reach 100 feet high during winter storms, meaning the entire rock frequently disappears underwater. Biologically speaking, Rockall is a dead zone. Nothing grows there except a few miserable patches of algae. Its only residents are seabirds, gannets and seagulls, who use it as a rest stop, because it has been a bird rest stop for millennia. The top of the rock is permanently stained white with centuries of accumulated hardened guano. It is not an island, it's a maritime hazard. It is the avian void. But in 1955, the British government looked at this miserable guano-encrusted spike and panicked. The Cold War was heating up. The British were testing their first guided nuclear missiles in the nearby Hebrides Islands. The paranoia in London was absolute. The Ministry of Defense convinced themselves that the Soviet Union was going to send a submarine, climb up this 60-foot vertical cliff of bird shit and install a secret radar array to spy on British missile tests. Now think about the sheer logistical insanity of that fear. The Soviets couldn't even keep their tractors running properly in 1955, but the British were terrified that Ivan was going to build a high-tech listening post on a rock that spreads half the winter underwater. So the British decided that they had to strike first. They had to claim Rockall for the Queen. On September 18, 1955, the Royal Navy dispatched the HMS Vidal. They didn't just sail past and wave a flag. They launched a military helicopter. They lowered elite Royal Marine commandos and a civilian naturalist onto the slippery guano-covered peak. I want you to picture this historical moment. You are a highly trained British commando. You have been trained to kill men with your bare hands, and your commanding officer drops you into a rock in the middle of the ocean, hands you a brass plaque, and tells you to conquer it. Imagine the military briefing for that morning. Alright lads, the Soviets have nuclear submarines and we have a 60-foot pile of seagull excrement. I need you to slide down a rope in a hurricane force winds, try not to get pecked to death by gannets and seagulls, and glue a piece of brass to the guano. For Queen and country. And the wildest part, they actually did it. They cemented a brass plaque to the rock, hoisted the British flag, and formally annexed Rockall into the British Empire. It was the last territorial expansion of the British Empire in history. They didn't conquer India or Africa this time, they conquered a rock that smelled like fermented fish. They sailed home feeling like absolute geopolitical geniuses, completely unaware that they had just opened a legal Pandora's box that would haunt international courts for the next 70 years. Now you might be asking, why didn't the British just blow the rock up? If it's a hazard and you're worried about Soviet spies, just drop a bomb on it and go home, right? Well, welcome to the bureaucratic world. Welcome to the magical, hallucinatory world of international maritime law. By the 1970s, the United Nations was drafting the Convention on the Law of the Sea. The rules of the ocean were changing. The UN declared that if a country owns an island, they don't just own the land, they own the water around it. Specifically, they get an inclusive economic zone that stretches 200 nautical miles in every direction from the coastline. Suddenly, the math changed. If Rockall is just a rock, it means nothing. But if Rockall is legally classified as an island belonging to the United Kingdom, then the UK suddenly owns a 200-mile radius of the North Atlantic Ocean. We are talking about 160,000 square miles of ocean floor. And what is under that ocean floor? Billions of dollars worth of untapped oil, natural gas, and some of the richest fishing grounds on the planet. In a matter of years, this worthless guano-covered spike transformed from a military joke into a multi-billion-dollar lottery ticket. The British government looked at Rockall and suddenly saw Dubai. But there was a massive, hilarious legal catch. Article 121 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea states a very specific rule. Rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life on their own shall have no exclusive economic zone. Let me translate that from lawyer speak to English. If you want the oil, you have to prove that a human being can actually live on the rock. You have to prove that a 60-foot vertical spike with no water, no food and no shelter can sustain an economic life. This is where human greed completely overrides basic reality. The British government, wearing their finest tailor suits in London, had to legally argue that Rockall was a cozy, habitable destination. Your Honor, the Crown argues that the vertical cliff face, which spends half of the winter completely submerged under freezing waves, is actually a thriving, vibrant metropolitan hub. And the corrosive bird feces that is simply a robust local agricultural sector. We rest our case. The absurdity was staggering, but UK wasn't the only one playing this game. As soon as the oil and gas reserves were discovered, every country in the North Atlantic suddenly remembered that they too really love this rock. The Republic of Ireland stepped in and said, "Hold on, Rockall is closer to our continental shelf. It's Irish." Iceland raised its hand and said, "Actually, it's on the Rockall Plateau, which is clearly Icelandic territory." Denmark, on behalf of Faroe Islands, chimed in, "Excuse me, we also cold and like fish. The rock is ours." Four modern, highly developed democratic nations were suddenly locked in a vicious diplomatic standoff over a piece of granite that you couldn't even pitch a tent on. They were drawing overlapping circles on maps, threatening each other's fishing fleets, and deploying naval vessels to aggressively stare at each other across the freezing waves. The geopolitical void had consumed them all. They were no longer fighting over land, they were fighting over a legal loophole. But the British knew if they wanted to win the court case, they couldn't just rely on paperwork. They had to prove the unprovable. They had to put a human being on that rock and keep him alive long enough to satisfy the UN technicality. And that's when the thing went from legally absurd to biologically suicidal. Now, if you want to legally prove that a 60-foot vertical spike of bird excrement is a habitable island, you can't just send a lawyer with a briefcase. You need a lunatic. You need someone whose psychological makeup completely bypasses the human instinct for self-preservation. Enter the British Special Air Service. Enter Tom McLean. By 1985, the legal battle over the North Atlantic oil rights was reaching a boiling point. The United Nations was demanding a proof of human habitation. The British government realized that they had to physically occupy the rock. They needed a man to go live on a rockle, not just for a weekend, but long enough to legally constitute a residence. Tom McLean was a former SAS paratrooper, survivalist, and the first man to row single-handed across the North Atlantic. He was exactly the kind of guy who looks at a suicide mission and asks, "Do I get a pack of my own tea?" The logistics of this occupation are a masterpiece of the survival void. You cannot build a house on Rockall, there is no flat ground. So McLean's team designed a survival pod. It was essentially a reinforced plywood box, roughly the size of a large refrigerator, painted bright orange. In the summer of 1985, they sailed out to the rock. While 100-foot Atlantic swells crashed around them, McLean and his team literally drilled into the granite cliff face and bolted this wooden box to the side of the rock. Now, let's pause and appreciate the absolute madness of this setup. Tom McLean climbed into a wooden box, bolted to a vertical cliff, 300 miles from the nearest hospital, surrounded by the most violent ocean on the planet. And then the boat left. He stayed there for 40 days. For over a month, McLean lived inside the avian void. His daily routine consisted of freezing temperatures, deafening winds, and the constant terrifying vibration of the ocean trying to rip this plywood box off the rock. He had no running water, no heat, and his only company were thousands of highly aggressive seagulls who were absolutely furious that a British man had moved into their bathroom. Just imagine the official UN habitability check. Hello, Mr. McLean? Yes, this is the United Nations calling to verify your economic activity. And McLean freezing in the wooden box screaming back, "I just traded a piece of cheddar to a seagull so it would stop pecking at my window. The economy is booming. God save the Queen." Now, this wasn't an exploration, it was a legal theater. Tom McLean was enduring psychological and physical torture purely so bureaucrats in London could draw a larger circle on a map than claim the oil underneath it. He proved that a human being could survive on Rockall, in the same way you could technically survive being locked inside a washing machine if someone occasionally threw a sandwich in. But it worked. McLean's 40-day occupation became the cornerstone of the UK's legal claim. They had their permanent occupant. They had their island. While Tom McLean was fighting off seagulls on the surface, a much darker, much more expensive game was being played beneath the waves. Welcome to the submarine void. You see, Rockall wasn't just about oil and fish, it was about the apocalypse. During the height of the Cold War, the GIUK gap was the most critical naval checkpoint on the planet. If the Soviet Union wanted to send their nuclear-armed submarine to the Atlantic to threaten the American East Coast, they had to pass through this gap. Rockall sits right in the middle of this strategic nightmare. The British and the Americans were desperately trying to track Soviet Akula-class and Typhoon-class submarines. They were laying down massive networks of underwater hydrophones, the SOSUS system, to listen for the acoustic signature of Soviet propellers. Because the UK claimed the 2,000-mile radius around Rockall, they essentially claimed the right to militarize that water. They used the rock as a legal justification to aggressively patrol the area, drop sonar buoys, and harass Soviet subs. Now imagine the absolute absurdity of this underwater chess match. You have multi-billion-dollar Soviet nuclear submarines capable of raising entire continents, creeping silently through the black freezing depths of the Atlantic, and above them, British destroyers are dropping death charges and pinging sonars, all legally justified by a 60-foot rock covered in bird shit. It was a silent, terrifying game of cat and mouse. The Soviets knew the British were using Rockall as a legal shield. The British knew the Soviets knew, and the Irish and the Icelanders were furious because they felt the British were using a fake island to monopolize the Cold War naval theater. The submarine void is the realization that the fate of the world, the literal trigger for World War III, was tethered to a piece of granite. If a Soviet submarine captain panicked and fired a torpedo at a British frigate near Rockall, the ensuing nuclear holocaust would have been legally sparked by a territorial dispute over a seagull latrine. The Cold War was defined by mutually assured destruction. But Rockall proves that it was also defined by mutually assured stupidity. The greatest military empires in human history were risking global annihilation over a technicality. You would think that with the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dawn of the 21st century, humanity would have moved past this. You would think we would look at Rockall, laugh at our own historical stupidity and leave the rock to the birds. You clearly haven't been paying attention to the year 2026. Welcome to the resource void. The geopolitical circus hasn't ended. It has just been rebranded. Today the Soviet submarines are mostly gone, but the greed has exponentially multiplied. The dispute over Rockall is hotter than ever, and the magic word is no longer communism. The magic words are Brexit and deep sea mining. When the UK left the European Union, the entire framework of European fishing rights collapsed. Suddenly, Scottish fishermen and Irish fishermen were no longer sharing the waters under EU quotas. They were competitors, and the waters around Rockall happened to be packed with incredibly lucrative stocks of haddock and monkfish. In recent years, the Scottish government actually threatened to deploy naval protection vessels to board and arrest Irish fishing boats that dared to cast their nets within 12 miles of Rockall. The Republic of Ireland responded by saying, "You can't enforce a 12-mile limit around a rock that isn't legally an island, you absolute lunatics. We literally have modern democratic European nations threatening to board each other's civilian vessels with armed guards or fish that swim near a rock." But fish are just the appetizer. The real main course is sitting on the seabed. Modern technology has unlocked the terrifying potential of deep sea mining. The ocean floor around the Rockall Plateau is believed to be rich in rare earth elements, cobalt crusts and polymetallic nodules, the exact materials needed to build electric car batteries, smartphones and the green energy grid of the future. The race for the seabed has reignited the Rockall dispute on a massive scale. The UK, Ireland, Iceland and Denmark are all currently lobbying the United Nations commissions on the limits of the continental shelf. They are spending millions of dollars on geological surveys, hiring armies of international lawyers and submitting thousands of pages of documents, all trying to prove that the dirt under their countries is geologically connected to the dirt under Rockall. Look at the absolute state of us. In 2026 we have artificial intelligence, we have rovers on Mars, we are mapping the human genome, but our geopolitical foreign policy is still dictated by the exact same primitive ape-like instincts that drove cavemen to hit each other with sticks or a shiny pebble. We are willing to risk diplomatic collapse, trade wars and military escalation. Also, corporations can scrape the bottom of the ocean to make a slightly faster iPhone. The occupation of Rockall is the ultimate monument of human arrogance. It is a physical manifestation of the geopolitical world. When you strip away the legal jargon, the UN treaties and the SAS commandos and the nuclear submarines, what are you left with? You are left with a fundamental truth about our species. We cannot tolerate a void. If there is a blank space on a map, even if that space is hostile, worthless, freezing spike of granite, human beings will find a way to claim it, monetize it, and threaten to kill each other over it. We took a rock that belonged to the ocean and the birds, bolted a plywood box to it, and called it an empire. It's hilarious, it's pathetic, and it's a perfect mirror of our civilization. We build our laws and our borders not on logic, but on the desperate need to own everything the light touches, even the things it doesn't. Next time you hear politicians talking about the sacred sovereignty of their borders or the vital strategic interests of the nation, just remember Tom McLean. Remember a man sitting in a wooden box, freezing in the dark, trading cheese to a seagull so a bureaucrat in London would claim oil rights. Stay strange, stay sharp, and whatever you do, don't let them convince you the rock is worth dying for. See ya.